I would say since Trump's election, even before, but since Trump's election, the chorus of articles in places like the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so on, talking about the really great performance of the American economy is amazing to me. What are you talking? 2.8%? Maybe. That's the best of the various estimates. There are many quite lower. But 2.8% the United States GDP grew in 2024, the year just ended. That's according to the IMF, which is a pro-Western institution. That's their number. They're as good or better than anybody else who does this kind of number. The same IMF says that this year, in 2024, the growth in China, 5%, double. In India, 7%, triple. What? India and China are the two central players in something called the BRICS. The gap between the BRICS and the G7, that's the American equivalent, is therefore growing, as it has every one of the last 25 years. You're not in great shape if that gap is growing. You're not. Or at least, let's put it this way. It's very odd to talk about what a great shape you are and leave discussion of this out. Because from this angle, it ain't so great. But we live in a country where it was necessary. I want to remind you, I'm sure you noticed, but the whole last 2 years of the Biden administration, the following phenomena really irritated people. The economy, all the economics people were doing great. The president, doing great. But poll after poll of the American people said the economy is the number one problem we have. So there was article after article which went like this. Why are the American people misunderstanding the reality of the economy? And there were lots of advice to the Democrats. Be careful, you're going to get hurt in the election. You've got to make people understand just the idea that the economists might be looking at the wrong thing and the mass of people looking at something else, and that would explain why they had a different... No, could not raise the most obvious. What? You had to make one side or the other stupid. So the mass of the people are ill-informed, inadequately. What are you doing? You have the greatest control over mass media of any society, and you have for a long time. If the masses don't get it, what's the matter with your system? You've gotten them to believe everything else you need. You can't get this. They couldn't break out of it. And it did hurt them in the election. But I'm here to tell you that the American economy is in terribly difficult conditions. And now the anxiety that he's provoking this, particularly with I'm cutting back. I have a good friend, a woman who works in a shelter in New York City. Several hundred people live in this shelter. And they were going to close this coming August. She explained to me yesterday it has been moved up till March because the government money is drying up. And then they had a scare last week when he issued that order because some official in Washington told them they might have to close this next week, dumping several hundred people onto the streets of New York City.
At this time of year.
At this time of year. So they can join the others sleeping in the subway tunnels of New York City. And also, since a number of these people have fairly serious emotional or mental problems, who knows? New York, my wife will not go on the subway anymore. She's afraid. She's afraid of random physical violence, which particularly affects women. There's a person who's not even about to steal, who just comes up and bashes you in the head with a brick or something because you remind them of their mother or their cousin or some bad moment in their lives or something. You know, it's just, whoa. So I could give you endless statistics, but it's an economy in a lot of trouble. And here again, the notion of irrelevance. It's not that what he does has no impact. It does. But there's no link between a concerted, strategic approach to a clearly defined, logical target. That's why the naughty and the theatrics seem to be mostly what this is about. Poking liberals in the eye, you know, being offensive in your language, being dramatic. I'm taking the canal, I want Greenland, screw NATO, screw Denmark, and all of this. What's it for? He's not going to help the situation with any of those countries. Denmark, Europeans, I can assure you, are up in arms that for them, they never heard of this. A member of NATO is basically taking the property of another member of NATO. The whole point of NATO was not to have this. You know, they used to tell each other how they have to love each other and take care of each other because of the big Russian bear that's bearing down on them. What happened to the Russian bear? You know, why are you? And so the fear. This is a whole other conversation we ought to have. This is the end of Europe as a major player in the world economy. And that has not happened for centuries. And people not to understand that is going to be a traumatic feature of our lives in the years ahead are not understanding what's going on. The turmoil inside these countries, the loss of the war in Ukraine, the end of NATO, all of these things are happening, and meanwhile, Europe has no role in the innovative economy of the future. It's all the United States, and above all, China. And DeepSeek happens in China. It doesn't happen in Germany or England. And those economies, Germany is in recession now. Its GDP is negative, it's shrinking. It used to be the engine of Europe. In German, it's called Wirtschaftswunder. It's the economic miracle. Germany coming back, losing the 2 world wars, and now it's a basket case. It can't function. And you know the irony? It's their Americanism that killed them. When the United States decided to have this war in Ukraine, to set Zelensky up to fight the Russians with American money and American weapons, they demanded the fealty of the Europeans to provide money and to provide weapons, which they did. And since the military prospects weren't so good, they waged a sanctions war against Russia. The most important part of which was Europe's refusal to continue to buy cheap oil and gas from Russia, which is the world's second greatest source of cheap oil and gas. And to make the point clear, remember, they cut the underwater pipeline. Okay, so who's the biggest user of cheap oil and gas? Germany. Turns out the Wirtschaftswunder was because you had cheap energy, which nobody else could compete with because the Russians provided it at dirt cheap prices. So they refused. They had to turn then for their energy to the world market, including the United States, which now ships huge quantities of liquefied natural gas to the Europeans at a much higher price. The Germans can't compete. The German industry is leaving Germany. For the first time in 60 years, the number one company in Germany, Volkswagen, is closing factories and laying off thousands of workers, and therefore having enormous conflict with the powerful union. What's going on here? Is it possible, the whole world asks, that the Americans and the Europeans couldn't see that when you punish Russia with sanctions that stop you from buying oil and gas, that they will find someone else to sell it to? And maybe the BRICS that they're part of would have the Chinese and the Indians buy the oil and gas, which is what happened. That they didn't see it? Is the level of denial and delusion so deep that we're going to see one horrific miscalculation like this after another? Everywhere in Europe, it is understood that the war in Ukraine is being lost. Except here.
Before we return to some of those other rhetorical flourishes of Trump, I would like to talk about two domestic policies that I think really nicely bring together some of the other things we've been talking about, like oil, gas, energy, competition with the BRICS that are really trouncing us, and even the LA wildfires. And that is Trump's climate change policies. Because, I mean, here are here's the sort of tangle that I see. One, it seems like climate change, I mean, some people on the right, for instance, don't believe that there is any,
right,
but it might prove an existential issue for us, as evidenced by LA, again, ostensibly. But then on the other hand, as far as economic competition goes, it seems like some of our competitors aren't beholden to the same climate change measures that we've been taking in the United States. And so repealing them might better enable us to compete with the countries to whom we're ceding our dominance.
There's a risk that the climate people are right, and that the rising temperature of the oceans and pollution levels are very dangerous for our future. There's a risk, they're right. There's also a risk that the people who don't believe any of that are right. I agree. I don't know. First of all, I'm not such a scientist. I'm not up on all of that. I see a risk on both sides. But I must say, it seems obvious to me that we'd be better off not risking that the right wing is correct. Let's take the other one. Let's do the steps we think will help, because if it's right, it's our existence. Rather than play Russian roulette with the right wing and say, well, it's not certain, so let's not worry about it. I mean, why would you do that? I don't understand. And when you look at who's spending the money to convince everybody, then it becomes obvious, doesn't it? It's Exxon and Mobil and all the it's the right wing together with the big businesses that are funding them. So for me, oh boy. So on the one hand, we have alarmist scientists, I get it, and they may be alarmist beyond what's appropriate. That's possible. I understand. There's a risk that that's wrong. But on the other hand, I see self-interested corporations promoting something that holds on to the profit of their fossil fuel foundations, and people who are saying it might be wrong. But I'm saying, yeah, it might be wrong, but wouldn't we be better off taking steps to deal with it than not? I don't see what refutation there is to this, so I end up with the people who want to do stuff about it, who want to limit our... And since I see it dovetailing with other things, I think the private car is a ridiculous notion We oughtn't to do that. The single largest polluter of air is the automobile exhaust. So, for me, let's have public transportation. Let's go back to the collective housing we once had back at the end of World War II, and that was a serious project here in the United States. Let's take the steps that would mitigate global warming and all the rest of it, because that's the path that makes more sense. And in order to say that, I don't have to denounce the people who are skeptical about all of it. I understand. There's basis to be skeptical. I don't like the lineup of who's telling me to be skeptical, but I understand the skeptics may be right. I don't want to get into a position where I know scientifically. I'm not going there. My liberal friends do that. They don't need me, and I don't agree with them anyway about it. For me, that's... Mr. Trump has made his decision. He panders to the fossil fuel. He panders to the audience that those companies have created for him. Because the establishment politically adopted at least a public commitment to climate control, attacking the establishment works if he attacks. This is the elitists in California who give a shit about all of this. He is a one-trick pony, Mr. Trump. You could see it when they had the awful American Airlines Army helicopter crash in Washington, D.C. a few days ago, and Mr. Trump has to talk about it by blaming the diversity, equality, inclusion movement for having created the inadequate airport management.
That goes back to Victor Davis Hanson and Los Angeles wildfire response. The same idea that it's this left-wing ideological captured incompetence that has caused a lot of these
They
issues.
captured air traffic controllers. Yeah. As I said, it's a one-trick pony. This is an attempt to make... Look, when you asked me earlier, why do I do economics? I showed you that... I hope I did. I hope I showed you that I'm not arguing that economics is more important than anything else. I don't believe it is. I never have.
Mm-hmm.
I focus on it, no question, but not because it's the most important thing. I focus on it because it was the excluded, tabooed issue, and that drew me. And I still think that's the case. Americans are afraid of thinking and talking about the economics of things because of where it takes you and where the political end of that conversation is. I think that's why they hold back from it. But Hanson, that's a different argument. He focuses on, these elitisms or because he really thinks that's the key item. He actually thinks the key item, I don't think the economics are the key item of anything, but I am struck by the exclusion of the economic dimension of things. It's extraordinary, and I'm going to talk about that because you don't want to. I think that has something to teach us, and I'm going to stress that, but I'm not going to say this is the cause. So if Hanson and I were debating, he would say this is why it happened, and because the elite, and then not me. I'm not going to. No, it didn't want that. It was this. You know what I mean?
Well, if you're ever in the Bay Area again, maybe I could arrange.
I go there I go to the Bay Area as often as I can. I really find it a wonderful place. I like that city. I admit I like the climate. I like the ocean. It's just people are very friendly. It's a very attractive place for me, but New York City is also doesn't have those qualities. I like New Orleans. I like New York. I like San Francisco.
The other thing I wanted to bring up right now isn't so much a policy issue, but just a broader domestic economic issue going forward, and one that I think your Marxist or Marxian, you've been using that word, analysis might be really helpful with. It also connects to DeepSeek, automation, electric vehicles, and that is the role of advancements in AI in the competition between China and the United States, and also just the overall health of our domestic workforce.
I don't know quite how to get at what it is I would want to say about that. China has demonstrated now, and I believe this is true to almost every reasonable person, whether they like China or not, whether they support what China is or don't. They have demonstrated that economic growth can be achieved faster in their kind of system than it can in any other kind. And that is a momentous, that's a momentous achievement. Over the last 30 to 40 years, they have consistently grown, as measured by their GDP, 2 to 3 times faster than the United States. I must remind people, even though they hate to hear it, that before this speedy growth, the Soviet Union accomplished speedy growth. Not as fast, but speedy growth. So that the painful reality, so painful it can't be spoken, is that the 20th and 21st centuries demonstrated the growth potential and the growth actuality most effectively in the Soviet Union and China. If you look at the Soviet Union as the first experiment in what I'm about to describe as their economic system, and China as the second, right? Russia starts in 1917, China in 1949, that's quite a difference. But by now we have 70 years, roughly 70 years of the Soviet Union, and now 70 years of China. And the Chinese growth faster, more spectacular than the Russian. The Russians were a system of state enterprises throughout industry and a growing proportion of state enterprises in agriculture. And very little scope for capitalist enterprises throughout that time. Not zero, that's an American fantasy, but small. China is completely different. China made a decision after Mao to become a hybrid, to be partly state-owned and operated enterprises, half, and the other half private capitalist enterprises, both Chinese and external allowed. So that I think it's fair to say that China represents a hybrid trying to combine both the benefits of a private capitalism model United States and of a state-owned and operated enterprise system, example, the Soviet Union. They really are a 50-50 split. With the hybrid of these two systems overseen by a communist party and a powerful state apparatus controlled by that party. And they've achieved really an unspeakable story Let me give you one statistic just to put in your head. The GDP of the United States, 28 trillion bucks, more or less. The GDP of Russia, our former arch enemy today, is $3 or $4 trillion. No content, nothing. And that was always true. I mean, only in the Cold War legacy mentality of the United States did Russia loom, silly economic nonsense. Anyway, that's not true with China. China's GDP now, 18, 19, 20 trillion dollars. Way different from Russia, and equally so from anywhere else. Britain's GDP, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 trillion, something like that. Very small.
Bigger than Russia, though.
What?
Bigger than Russia.
Probably bigger than Russia, yeah. And Russia fighting NATO means Russia's fighting Britain, France, Germany. Italy is refusing. That's different. But look what China has done. China was one of the poorest countries on the planet in 1949 and is now number 2. Unquestionably number 2 after the United States, and each year closing the gap. That is an astounding achievement. It's just very, very hard for me not to dwell on it. But one of its components, and one of the reasons it has the achievement, will take us to the technology issue. A powerful Communist Party ruling a powerful state apparatus, supervising this hybrid, can do something quickly and efficiently that the United States either can't do or can't do quickly and efficiently. It can mobilize the entire economy to achieve certain priorities. It can mobilize the government sector in its ways and the private sector in its ways. It can force them to collaborate and coordinate so that the resources each has are brought together to attack a problem. It does not respect private profit as the priority, which is what happens here. It does not believe that private has to be given primacy in some sense, as happens here. It doesn't have a government filled with people who believe that the private is in some sense the more important, the more patriotic, the more deserving, the more what. It doesn't have any of that. In fact, it has the other. One of the elements of socialism or communism that has a real effect here is that the people involved in the public sector believe in it, respect it, even value it higher than the private. In recent years in China, you have seen programs punishing leading private capitalists, Jack Ma and others like that, kind of dressing them down, in some cases imprisoning them, but mostly culturally saying, you are not, yet we will let you be a billionaire. We will. And we will let you run your business. But when you overstep in this hybrid, we're going to give you a slap on the wrist or worse, because you're not, and there's enormous support in the public sector for that. Americans have a very hard time grasping how different this is. Here in the United States, just by comparison, the presumption is that government is a bureaucracy full of unnecessary people, the fact. Economic fact. So Mr. Trump gets a lot of support for nominating the head of a private bureaucracy, Mr. Musk, to clean out the public bureaucracy. As if him being the proprietor of another bureaucracy didn't disqualify him. What? Why? What are you doing? What are you doing? This man has an enormous bureaucracy. He has a business that spans the whole world, or multiple businesses that span the whole world. He's got a complicated, overlapping mess of the bureaucracy, like all bureaucracy. But no. Instead, the mentality is the private bureaucracy is efficient, lean, effective. It's always the public bureaucracy that isn't, though. That's a completely different way of thinking about, and it translates into different little decisions along the way. Made in this office in Idaho and that office in Vermont, that because of this private profit, a private public notions. It's remarkable. I think it enabled Xi Jinping, the current leader in China, to realize that the efforts of the United States to constrict and constrain China, focused as they were on, among other things, artificial intelligence, meant that in order to have a chance, China could mobilize its resources in a way that Europe could not. Europe didn't have the hybrid economic systems, way too much private, and they didn't have national unity, too much tension among the countries of the EU. So they could not mobilize, not across the public-private boundary, not across the national boundary. So they couldn't, and they didn't. But the Chinese, who had less of some kinds of resources than Europe, if you take Europe as a total, they could. And they're not going to change this because it's working. That's why they are able now to compete in AI. That's what the importance of the DeepSeek explosion was. It wasn't the details of one program versus another. These are they call learning modules. What this is about is a sign, which is, by the way, a number of American commentary made this, and they're right. They compared it to 1957. And because I'm old enough, I was alive then. I remember it. 1957 was when Russia, Soviet Union then, sent up a man in space, a Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin. I remember the name of the Russian astronaut who was there. And America went crazy because the whole notion that we were number one meant that we Americans would be the first in space. And here we're not just another country, that would have been bad enough, but the bad country had done it. This is comparable. It's a sign that a country we thought was far behind us isn't. And I think you've seen a kind of quasi-hysteria already in Washington as the whole establishment reinforces itself. No, stop. Even though the war in Ukraine is with Russia, we really should be focused on China. My guess, I don't know, of course, but my guess that if Mr. Trump delivers on his promise to end the war in Ukraine, he will do so in the name of focusing on the much greater danger represented by China. The truth of it is, the Chinese at this point are not our problem because they don't need, all they want is free trade. All they want is to be allowed to do in the future what they've done in the past. It's the United States that has to have a change because it's terrified by the growth that the Chinese have achieved and that they look likely to continue, and therefore they have to be stopped. So what Americans cannot understand, because they don't want to face it, is that it's not that the Chinese are aggressive. It's really the reverse. It's the United States that's aggressive because it needs to stop what's going on. The Chinese don't. For the Chinese, let's go. We know how to go. We know how to beat you. We know how to grow. We do it better than you do. So just let us. And the United States says, we won't. We're going to stop you. We're going to slow you. And it's almost as naked as that if you look at the press these days. And, it's a question of whether the Americans have the means, I don't think they do, and have the determination, they may have that, to stay with this policy. I like to remind them that after Britain tried twice to punish the United States for becoming independent, Revolutionary War, War of 1812, they gave up. And they basically worked out a deal. Americans would leave them alone and the rest of the world do their British Empire, and the British would respect that the United States now had an empire called the Monroe Doctrine. You can take this Western Hemisphere, we're taking everything else. And on that basis, we can all live happily together. And they did. They didn't go to war against each other since that time. Okay, so why not the United States sit down with China and do more or less the same? I don't understand why that isn't talked about. And I don't think that's because it isn't an option. I think it is. And I think Americans somewhere know that it is. But for the moment, they're all excited that they may have the ability just to blow the Chinese away, the way the Russians went away. And I think that's a mistake, but that's where we sit.
We're definitely going to come back to China because we need to end this conversation talking about the ultimate fate of the United States, and China is, of course, going to play a huge role in that. But there are still those two rhetorical issues that I wanted to talk about that we haven't gotten to yet. And I think the first one that you mentioned in our conversation is Greenland, and whether we need to take it from Denmark or... So what is the context here? Why would Trump... I mean, Greenland just seems like a non-entity. I don't really think about it that often, except we fly over it sometimes on our way to Europe. Why would Trump make this move? Was this a strategic move? What is he trying to get? Successful? Unsuccessful?
There are multiple factors. It's never, ever reducible to one. It's multiple. Saber rattling against a tiny country like Denmark is a tasteless piece of bluster. So I assume part of what's going on here is this, it's just bluster. It's just Mr. Trump being, this is something nobody would say or do in the modern way. You don't have relationships between countries handled in this way. It's just not done. And so he does it. So that's one thing that's going on here. Number two, he wants, and the argument is now getting stronger because of it, he seems to want to disrupt and dismember and destroy NATO. Because this certainly makes NATO look like nothing if it goes through. It already makes it look like nothing that this could even happen. Now, that's a whole conversation. What would the logic be? But I remind you of what I said earlier. I can tell you a logic for why Mr. Trump might want to get rid of NATO. But I would be articulating something further and better than anything he has said or anyone speaking for him has said. So I'm not sure it's me trying to come up with a strategical rationale. I mean, it would be me doing it, but I would have no way of knowing whether or not something like this is in the minds of because they're not saying anything like that, so who knows? But I don't see in him the strategic logic. Third, there already are U.S. military bases in Greenland. They've been there for years. So the notion that this is a security, there's not the slightest evidence that anybody else is encroaching, whatever that might mean, on the U.S. bases. The Danish government has not said a word to indicate that it doesn't want them. On the contrary, in the days since Trump started, they have offered more bases to the United States than they already have. So I don't see. He says it's national security. I have no idea. If you're looking for the Chinese, they don't have any role there particularly. So could they come one day? Yeah, but that's true anywhere. They could come one day and sit outside the harbor in any country on earth. I mean, so I find it very bizarre. Does Mr. Trump want to have the privilege for his sons to grab property and start building hotels and golf courses?
In Greenland?
Yes. You know what the argument there is? Which Mr. Trump has articulated.
Oh, really? I missed that.
Not this time, earlier.
Okay.
He articulated the argument that, you'll love this, climate change, which he doesn't believe in, means that it's getting warmer. And Greenland will be melting its ice. And more of Greenland will become livable.
That's a nice little contradiction.
Yes, you like that one? And he said this, he wants to build hotels and golf courses. By the way, that's what he does. Doesn't do it well. Lots of them are losing money, but he does that. He likes that. Sort of the real estate patrician's notion of having arrived. So that might be, he can make sure as president that his kids get the prime real estate rather than the shitty real estate, whatever. So when I make those arguments, since nobody else has expressed any interest, there's no competitive, Britain or Denmark, nobody that I know of is eager for Greenland. So I go back to the beginning. This is Mr. Tough Guy. And if I were going to play amateur psychologist, not just for Mr. Trump, but for the establishment here in the United States, then I'd come up with the following. To do the four things at once that he did, I'm going to take Panama Canal, I'm going to take Greenland, I'm going to make Canada the 51st state, and I'm going to
rename the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, not so much that. I'm going to hit Mexico with tariffs, deportation. Then this is classic American politics. That's nationalism. It's It's the glorification of the nation as the power that rules the world. We're going to do this to this country and this to that country. It goes with the territory. It's what a leader should do. You know, Mr. Trump said at the night of the election, when he couldn't claim a mandate, he talked a lot about unity. Presidents usually do after elections.
There hasn't been much unity.
No, there hasn't been, and there hasn't been even much talk. I mean, he did it the night of the election, and not much after that. Not much talk. Well, the country can get united around its empire, and we're sticking it to Panamanians, Danes, Canadians, and Mexicans. See that? We Americans are our leader. This.
Well, that does seem like a good strategic move if it helps bolster support for him by uniting people under a nationalist.
I think people are now sufficiently. I think we are sufficiently weaned away from the neoliberal globalization period, when an enormous effort was made to teach us to be okay with factories running away because the global economy would deliver goods and services more cheaply than otherwise, and everybody wins from this one, never true, but a nice story to tell. We've been weaned off of it, so now it's okay. The president can give billions to this industry, billions to that industry, hit the market with all of the stuff about don't tax out the window, all of the stuff about the free market, don't interfere in the free. He's interfering every day. His tariff is an interference in the free. It is the taboo, the Republican taboo. We won't tax, we don't interfere in the free market, and thereby we make your life better. It was always bullshit, but it was their bullshit. Many elections won by the Republicans were won because they promised either not to raise taxes or to cut them. They are the anti-tax. And now they've become the pro-tax party. Like they've become what free market? F the free market. We don't like this, we don't like this. We're going to interfere this way here, we're going to interfere that way over there. Taking countries is not leading things to the free market. You are not doing that. It's a nationalist turn, and it will be justified on the same grounds that nationalist turns always have been, which is threat from abroad. And you can then articulate it as fentanyl coming into your country. That's one threat abroad. Or vague, aggressive actions by the Chinese, which, the Chinese go out of their way to say we don't want to interfere in any of this. Just let us grow.